Hey everybody, I'm very honored to have Professor Noakes on the podcast today, The Low Carb Athlete. He has been on the show a couple times in the past 10 years. On our original podcast was Fit, Fat, Fast, and he is just always a resource you want to follow and catch up on his research because he's doing something always, and I don't think you're ever retiring. So thanks for coming on my show today after your work hours.
Thank you, Debbie. It's a privilege, and thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
So it's very funny. I'm drinking my Matula tea, if you've heard of that. It's from Cape Town. And I have two people I was talking to yesterday that know you. That one is a student, Kristen Flanagan. Flanagan, she went to hear her professor. And then another client, she's from Cape Town, and her father was in the Army with you. I'm like, that is so weird. I'm talking.
No, that would have been a long time ago, 1967.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, she's 50-something. So it was her father, and she lives in Seattle now. But I was like, wow, it's a small world. So it was.
Do you remember her name?
Her name is Julian. I don't know her maiden name, but I was trying to tell her, like, find out what your tell me what your maiden name is, so I can ask what your father's name was. So anyways, it's so funny how the world is connected, and you know what an impact you made. Actually, she just texted me. His name is Bing Walker.
Oh, yes.
So she said he was involved in a study with you at Sports Science Center 10 or 15 years ago, and he was related to heart disease and exercise.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
So, anyways, you've had a lot of influence of people all over the world. So you're pretty much an inspiration, and you don't stop. So give us kind of an update what you're doing. I know the Noakes Foundation keeps growing and growing, and there's lots of studies going on. Give us a little quick recap of what's going on in your world.
Well, thank you very much. So let's wind back to 2018. That's when my trial ended. And so I spent a lot of time, over about 6 years, I was being attacked from all corners. And I was able to defend ourselves and to present the low carbohydrate diet for 28 days at the trial. And we won the case. And so that was a massive achievement, because it shows that we proved that the low carb diet it's acceptable, it's safe, and it's not unconventional. That was the charge was that I was prescribing a diet that was unsafe and was unconventional, and we were able to prove that that's not the case. So thereafter, it took a bit of time to recover from all the stress. And I'll be quite frank, I had a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder. It was because when you're being attacked from all sides, it can get quite tough. But fortunately, I'm now completely all over that and can start focusing on other stuff. So I start working on the Noakes Foundation. And what we did was we raised quite a lot of money from a very kind American donor. And we wanted to look at how the liver functions in patients with low carbohydrate diets or high carbohydrate diets. And in collaboration with a team from Chicago, we were able to show that glucose production by the liver in people eating a low carbohydrate diet is completely normal. And even when they exercise, it's completely normal. So that's fantastic discovery, because it disproves the idea that if you're not eating carbohydrates, you're not producing enough glucose in the liver. We showed that's nonsense. Of course, we knew it had to be nonsense, but now that's documented, and we published that in a very good journal. Our next goal was to then say, right, let's take a group of diabetics and put them on this diet and see what happens, particularly to liver glucose production, because that's one of the real key abnormalities in the disease. You've got this liver that it pumps out glucose. And we wanted to show that if you have diabetes and we get you on the diet, that the liver glucose production goes down. Unfortunately, we ran out of money in the process. And what we were able to do, however, was to get the methods up and improve them and get them so we're ready for the next study. But what we did do was we found 28 people in Cape Town who adopted the low-carb diet just by reading the book, The Real Meal Revolution. So these were people who had not gone to a doctor, they hadn't gone to a dietitian, they hadn't been on some other intervention. Usually the doctor said to them, this is very dangerous for you, you shouldn't be on it. And we looked at those 28 and we discovered a couple of things. Firstly, the majority had either reversed the disease or put themselves into remission. And, you know, there's arguments about the terms. Their insulin use had gone right down and their use of other drugs had gone right down. And there's some who were completely free of all symptoms and their glucose control was perfect and they weren't using any medication. I was one of the group who, in fact, I still need to take some medication to have a normal glucose control. But the point was that we were able to show that you don't need a major intervention. If you give people the information and they're motivated, they can put their diabetes in remission. But what was really interesting was that we wanted to find out, so why did some people be successful and why were some people not so successful? And there was one differentiating factor, that's all. And that was that the people who were successful got rid of all their food addictions, all their food cravings. And they said what made it possible for them was they now controlled what they were eating. They personally controlled what they were eating. And so we realized then that this is a behavior disorder, diabetes, and it's driven by this desire to always be eating and craving foods. And to treat the disease, it's not getting your glucose under control. You've got to get your eating under control, and you've got to get the addictive eating stopped. And of course, that opens a whole lot of new, interesting ideas that it's a behavioral disease. And of course, the company Verde Health in San Francisco are the ones who are showing that if you encourage people to do the right behaviors, you can reverse the disease. So that's been one focus. What we've realized, however, is that it's very difficult to fund this type of research. It's very expensive, and we can't raise the funds always for that type of research. Mm-hmm. What we would like are the guys who have done that work was to take diabetics, because now we know that if you go on a low calorie, low carbohydrate diet, you can reverse your diabetes in 7 days. By that, I mean you can get your glucose control within 7 days.
For type 2 diabetes?
Type 2 diabetes. Yeah. Now, the people who promoted that idea from England said the key is that you must eat few calories. You must go on a starvation diet. Mm. And we don't think that's the key. We think the key is that you're not eating carbohydrates. So they had the diet that they were using was low in calories, but it was also low in carbs. And so, but hopefully we will be able to fund that study in due course. But that would be the next one, because we want to show it's not the starvation that does it. It's the low carbs that does it. And why is that important? Because in those trials where they put people on the starvation diet and they can put their glucose control, get it perfect within 7 days. The problem is you can't stay on that diet forever. And you have to go back to a more normal diet later on. And we think that's completely unnecessary. We think that if you just go on a low carb diet from day one, you never have to change because you're going to get the benefits from the first day. But you're also going to keep your health up because you're eating enough calories. So that would be a next study that we'd like done.
Would you implement fasting in that? Because the research of intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating or feeding, that seems like it would, overlap with that type of study.
Absolutely. That would be another variable to study. And I think that we would obviously do that later, because the first step is to see what people have done already. Mm-hmm. And you're quite right. Fasting is a big area, is really interesting. The problem is to get people to fast very quickly, to convert people from eating a high carbohydrate diet to do fasting is pretty difficult. You kind of have to go through the process of adapting. Yeah. So that would complicate that type of study.
Yes, makes sense.
So that's the one area. The other area which we realized is really our mission, is to make sure that the poorest people in this country can reverse their diabetes by eating a diet that they can afford. That's the key. Mm-hmm. Because most people think that this diet is expensive. And in fact, you can eat a cheap version, and we've developed a cheap, healthy version. And we've done a couple of trials in the communities in which it's a 6-week trial, and we show that the community gets much healthier when they just stop eating the sugars and the refined carbohydrates and start eating animal fat again. And that makes a huge difference. So we have done one decent trial. It unfortunately is not controlled in that we don't have a randomized. We still haven't been able to do a randomized controlled trial, but we have one group of 30 patients who we put through this trial, and their results are so dramatic that they couldn't have been produced by anything else but the diet. But that's been an important focus for us now.
Now, are you able to, I mean, to make it more affordable, animal fat, is it grass-fed and, you know, or is it factory processed food? I mean, because that gets complicated too, because then you're giving them animal fat, but I mean, how do you make it affordable to not have all the toxic meat fat?
Well, you know, it's really interesting in South Africa because, and I'm sure this happens in the North America as well, that if you go to the upmarket supermarkets, they cut the fat off and they give it away. So we have leads into those places, supermarkets, where we can get the fat for little. And the fat is then used in the place of butter and for cooking and for spreading on not on bread, but spreading on crackers.
Not on bread.
Not on bread. So that's but you're quite right. You know, Eric Westman, who influenced me and who saved my life by putting me on this diet when I read his book, The New Atkins for the New You, he said, listen, you must be, when you're getting people healthy, you can't make people eat perfect food if they can't afford it. And he even prescribed Spam for some of his poorer people. And he says the results are just as dramatic. So I think we have to, and that's why we call our thing Eat Better South Africa, not eat best or eat perfectly, eat better.
True.
And if you're eating so badly and we change it slightly, then it's a great improvement.
Well, I know Dr. Sarah Myhill in the UK, she does the PK diet, paleo keto, and I think she tries to make it affordable, in her treatment to help mitochondria function and fatigue is similar, that she's trying to make it affordable because she wants people just to be healthy. And I know Eric Westman, we were on Jimmy Moore's low carb cruise together last May, and we're not going this year, but we were talking a lot about that. Just like, how do you want everyone to just eat meat, get the animal fats and vegetables, but just he rather people just get what you can. And, you know, they were giving examples of going to fast food restaurants and just get the Wendy's burger patty, and that's better than the alternative.
Exactly. Yeah, we can't be perfect in the nutrition, but what people are eating is so bad. And what I'm beginning to realize, that it's animal fat that you want to get back in the diet. And from the research and the writing that I'm doing at the moment, it's clear once we removed animal fat from the diet, that's when we got started to get problems. But people don't recognize that. I mean, I'm one of the great advocates that it was replacing too much carbohydrates, which is part of the story. But removing animal fats might have been the problem. Currently, so you asked the other things. We'll come back to the rest of what the Noakes Foundation does. But I'm currently writing, and I'm hoping to turn this into a book, but I'm writing for the CrossFit organization because I've got great friends basically in CrossFit, but also I'm a good friend of the man who started it, Greg Glassman. And he set up a website and a blog for those people like myself who are questioning, and a couple of us write regularly. And I'm writing a series called It's the Insulin Resistance Stupid.
Good title.
It's not the cholesterol.
Yes.
And so I've written 12 columns, which are up and everyone can read them on crossfit.org. And they trace the history. I went back and I said, okay, so where does the word insulin resistance first appear in the medical literature? And I went right back to there. And then, of course, I uncovered this whole thing which got hidden, as always happens.
Yes.
So what I discovered was in the 1950s, there was a lady, Mary Olbrink, and her co-worker, Dr. Mann, and they had decided that carbohydrates caused blood triglycerides to go up. And in their sick people, they had high triglyceride levels, not necessarily high cholesterol levels. And they very interestingly had studied patients over 30 years, their populations, and they found that over 30 years, the diabetic patients, their triglycerides started to come higher and higher and higher, but the cholesterol level stayed pretty much the same. And the mortality amongst the diabetics, we know, is obviously as much worse than everyone else. So they said, that's really interesting that its triglycerides are going up and these people are getting sick. And then they said, what could possibly be driving it? And they said, well, the diets had changed between 1930 and 1960. They found that diabetic patients started to get 2, 3, 4 times as much carbohydrate. Because before we had insulin, diabetic patients were given low carbohydrate diets. And just to digress, there was a guy called Newberg who was working on this. And he said the worst thing that ever happened to type 2 diabetics was the discovery of insulin in 1920. Because he said, I was on the verge of proving that a low carbohydrate diet could control diabetes without requiring anything else. But along came insulin and the story changed. So all the patients with type 1 or type 2 diabetes all got insulin and they were allowed to eat the carbohydrate. And then you got this carbohydrate creep. Over the next 40 years, more diabetics were given more and more carbohydrate. So what Dr. Albring noticed was that it was the carbohydrates that were driving the triglycerides. And that was then described as carbohydrate-sensitive hypertriglyceridemia. Now, this reaches a crescendo in 1965, on July the 1st. Oh. And why do I know the date? Because it's a day before my birthday. Not that I was born in 65, but I was born on the 2nd of July. So July the 1st is easy to remember. And on that day, one of the key players in the sugar industry in North America went to Harvard Medical School. And he said, we've got a problem, guys. There were 4 articles in the Annals of Internal Medicine in the June 1965 issue of the Annals of Internal Medicine. And the final editorial was written by this lady. And the 4 papers all said carbohydrates are a problem in diabetes and in heart disease, and sugar's contributing. And so the sugar people spoke to the Harvard professors and they said, listen, we've got a good idea. Why don't you write an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine saying that sugar's fantastic and saturated fats are bad, which they did. And the debate on carbohydrates ended that day in 1967. Wow. So that killed the carbohydrate theory. Jeez. So it's amazing that there's one day, and that's the day.
That was it.
Finished. And that's why we battled since then. So anyway, so I'm writing all these articles, and this is what I've come up with. And I've just completed the next bunch of 11 columns in which I describe the 70 events between 1910 and 2019. 70 events that were used to drive the low-fat story, and also the evidence that they were all, that there was no evidence, that most of the evidence, I won't say was fraudulent, but it wasn't proper. And key studies which proved the opposite were hidden. And even studies which raise questions, which say, gosh, you know, it doesn't look like the low-fat diet is all it's cracked up to be. They got hidden. And the studies of low carbohydrates, which were beneficial, also got hidden. And so I've tried to put all together those. And when you look at it in a sequence of over 100 years, it's astonishing. There's just no evidence that cholesterol is causing heart disease.
Maybe Ansel Keys hid everything and ripped it up.
He did indeed. And it's been happening ever since. And it's just astonishing how it's happened. And the reason, and Nina Teicholz in her book describes this very well, that it just became the dogma, and it was driven by the American Heart Association and a small clique of about 7 or 8 doctors, scientists, who controlled everything. They controlled the funding, they controlled the publications, they controlled what you were allowed to write about. And if you put in a protocol like Jeff Volek has for the last 20 years, trying to study low carbs, no, we don't study low carbs, they're dangerous. And so that's how they prevent the research being done.
Well, we only know this information pretty much because of Volek and Finney and yourself, and you know what Dr. Eric Westman has done. And Nina's book, Big Fat Surprise, everyone should read that. And that's probably your next book is probably something like hers has 10 years of, or 50 years of history in it. And she did research for 10 years for that book.
Absolutely. I mean, I've obviously used huge amounts from her book because she and Gary Taubes describe all the information.
Yeah.
And I'm obviously talking to her about collaborations, and hopefully we'll get a collaboration going. Of course, I would love that, yeah. And it's just whether she wants to risk her career name by associating.
So. I don't think so. You're pretty well loved in our world.
Thank you.
So
that's and I've written to her, and she says, "Listen, I'm very busy, but let's talk about it in the summer, in your summer." So that's a month or two.
Oh, good.
And I'm hoping that we can do something together, because I think that, yeah, it's important, because Nina's book is astonishing, unbelievable book. Mm-hmm. And all I've simply done is taken all the bad science and show why the science was really bad, and show that how it all, when you put it all together. So the final chapter is, okay, so now let's look at all these 70 events and stack them up. Now, here are the ones that are meant to prove that the low carb, the low fat diet is healthy. Well, they just collapse into nothing. There is nothing. Wow. So then you say, well, where was the evidence? And of course, Nina points that out in her book, as does Gary. But I just want to put it all together and focus on specifically, okay, so where's the evidence?
Yeah.
And if you had to give it in a court of law, as I did, you'd have nothing. There would be no evidence to support it.
It's sickening, isn't it? Doesn't it just make you angry when you go back and read that research? I mean, it just always gets me fired up when when I was reading her book for my nutritional therapy program. We were required to read that book, and I just reading it, get so mad. It's like, and it's such an uphill battle, it's just constantly trying to win over the political nutrition and big pharma and everyone behind it. It's just even what we're dealing with the COVID-19 treatment. It's like, okay, we have to work on the why, and what you're showing is proving that there's no science. And like, here's how you get healthy, is working on what you said earlier, self-care, your relationship with food, what you're putting in, environmental triggers. So it's really, commendable to you that you keep working at it, because it is a constant battle.
Sure. And Nina, of course, is in the front lines there, and writing frequently about the problems with the new committee drawing up the new guidelines and how they're so conflicted. I think I'm just amazed that she continues to fight the fight. But I know, that's the nature of us. We'll always fight until we see progress. But you mentioned COVID-19, which is really interesting, because I got into huge trouble in South Africa in the last week or so. Because and I think I know where it was, because in the end, I was speaking about diabetes being the major risk factor with heart disease and hypertension. And therefore, the authorities should be telling everyone, you've got to reverse diabetes, you've got to eat better. And they don't want to do that. So it's really interesting in South Africa, because when the Minister of Health announces every day, they announce who died today. And because we have like 2 or 3 deaths, he can say it was a 49-year-old person with type 2 diabetes, or 50-year-old female with heart disease. And they say that. And they say there are many comorbidities. But then they don't take the next step and say, well, actually, let's address the comorbidities and get the population healthy.
I know.
And so the fact that I kind of said that, there's actually censorship of what you're allowed to say now about the COVID virus in this country. So you have to be very careful. And I just made the point that it's very clear from the physicians treating these patients realize that the virus is doing more things than we know, because it's not just the lung disease that's causing very low oxygen tension in the blood. There's something else going on. And it looks like the red blood cells are affected in some way, and they're not working properly. Mm-hmm. And this has had a huge influence, because the treatment, the management has changed radically in 3 weeks. It's astonishing. So the protocols that you had to absolutely follow these at pain of death, mm-hmm. in 3 weeks they've changed. And they've changed because 1 or 2 doctors went on social media and said, we're worried, this is not right, there's something not working. And very quickly, other emergency physicians working in patients realized that there's something else going on, and they started doing what these guys were doing and realized they were getting better results in this particular group of patients. So but that's interesting, because how can you believe that a medical practice could be changed so quickly? It's never happened in medicine before. Normally in medicine, it takes 20 years for a new idea to percolate through. But because of this crisis, physicians realize there's something else, and they're changing the way that the protocol, and because they see it's better and works better.
So what are they doing differently? Do you know?
Yeah. So the protocol says that when a patient comes in and their oxygen tension in the blood, and they've clearly got pneumonia, and their oxygen tension in the blood is below a certain value, you have to intubate them. Now, in most patients with chronic lung disease who are in really bad state, when they come in and their oxygen tension is that low, they're semi-conscious or unconscious. And the treatment is to intubate them. And of course, when you put a tube down someone's throat, they gag and they fight it if they're conscious. So that's why it's possible to do that if the patient is so sick that they're unconscious. Now, what some doctors recognized was that this wasn't happening in these patients, that with a particular lung pattern in this disease, in COVID infections, the patients had very low oxygen tensions, and the protocol said you must intubate. The problem was the patient was talking and was conscious. And so now they had to tell the patient, listen, I'm going to have to knock you out, make you unconscious, so that I can put this tube in. And then they suddenly realized that when they intubated that group of people, they didn't do as well as they expected to. So then there was something else going on. So then they said, well, maybe if we just give more oxygen and don't intubate, that might work. And that's what's been happening, that these patients do a lot better. This particular group, I'm not saying everyone, this particular group of patients with COVID infections do better with given lots of oxygen and not intubated. And if they can be kept off the intubation, they'll have a much better chance of surviving. So it's been astonishing to see how, and the papers are coming out, the scientific papers are coming out now already. And what's another interesting thing is that a paper that came out 2 days ago from an Italian group who describe how you make the differential diagnosis and how you treat was sent to me on Twitter by a lay person. So now the lay people are educating the doctors and telling all the doctors.
I guess that's what we have to do these days to help spread the information and keep.
Yeah, no, absolutely correct.
So
sorry, carry on.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask if it was vitamin C IV, or are they doing? Are you guys doing that?
I think that's a lot of, they're looking at all these things, and I think in China they've used vitamin C intravenously, and what's interesting about this, I think it's going to change medicine substantially, this crisis, because all of a sudden it's acceptable to use zinc, or it's acceptable to use vitamin C intravenously and not be called a quack.
Yeah.
Because in the past, if you used suggested supplements make you better, then you're a quack. And I think that's gone away. But also, I think the public are becoming more and more reluctant to accept everything that medicine says, because I don't think medicine has failed the people, but all of a sudden, we doctors couldn't solve this problem. The virus came along and there was no solution except lockdown. So that people perhaps are starting to question, well, maybe medicine doesn't have all the answers, and we can't give over all responsibility to doctors. But I also think that this is the greatest potential advance for the low-carb diet ever.
Yeah.
Because now it's very clear the biggest risk factor in North America for this infection is obesity. That's the #1 risk factor in the Journal of American Medical Association.
Yeah.
So if you're going to advise people to avoid the virus, you've got to focus on obesity.
I know. And this is why, I would say, what's a gift in all experiences, and I keep podcasting and writing and researching and posting and just trying to get this information out of self-care. And what I call the holistic method, you have to work on the whole you, and that includes, the nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress reduction, movement, all that, digestion, gut health, and the importance of, what you eat, how you eat, when, and why is, as you were saying, why you're eating, and that relationship to food that's causing that food addiction to overeat carbohydrates and give you that insulin resistance to get you type 2 diabetes, but also proper digestion and gut health. And no one, in the medical field don't talk about that, but that's what I keep trying to share. It's like your immune system is 80% or so in your gut wall linings. Shouldn't we be staying at home and working on that instead of isolating and hibernating and not being, active and being afraid to go outside the door?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and it's going to be so interesting. Now, we're locked down for 5 weeks. I don't know if you're locked down for any length of time.
Well, I'm in Seattle, so it's kind of where it started from China. So we are through middle May 14th.
Middle May.
Yeah,
Gosh.
so we're like 2 months total.
How many cases have there been in Seattle?
I haven't watched as much because I've been watching BBC because I like their news stories over the US stories. So, but it's getting better. I don't know what the total numbers are as much as the rest of the world, but it is starting to get better. But what my concern is, I keep saying, as I just said, you're at home. We're not spreading the virus because we're at home. But once you go back to regular life, are we not going to spread the virus because you're still not healthy and you're still obese and you still have leaky gut and dysbiosis and all this stuff that's unidentified? So that's my concern is, shouldn't you take self-responsibility and ownership of your own health and do something about it so we don't continue to spread this virus and have our world deteriorate in what the future is going to have happen?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But one's not allowed to say that.
No.
because that doesn't fit some model that I don't know about. That's what's driving this whole thing. Yeah. What's interesting, and I mean, I'm sure this guy's wrong, but an Israeli professor said that the virus only hangs around for 70 days in any population, and then it disappears like magic.
Who knows? It disappears when it gets to be 100 degrees out. So if we all just live in our infrared saunas or go to Africa in your summertime. So with going on with low carb and getting back to what your research is finding and the importance of low carb for health, how does that help our ability to, of course, it helps us burn fat, and we've talked about that a ton over the years, but working on our mitochondria function is what I keep trying to tell people too. Energy, fatigue, you said you had stress, post-traumatic stress after going through that whole lawsuit. And so what do we do to improve our resiliency in our immune system by eating low carb? But how does that connect with our mitochondria and just overall energy and happiness and thriving every day?
Yeah, I really, I think I'm stressing moving out of my area of expertise, but I'm also, these areas are difficult to research, and I'm not sure that we have all the evidence as yet. I think that the evidence is that people's health improves so dramatically on low carb diets that it must be affecting everything in the body. And I would, if you believe what Steve Phinney says, that it's the ketosis is also dramatically improving mitochondrial health, immune function, and that intermittent fasting does the same. So I think that there's probably a very high probability that that's true. It's not an area that I've yet focused on specifically. I'm still trying to get people to just get their glucose under control, and then we can start doing all the other stuff that you speak about.
Well, that's the point, though, to work on that, and the rest just happens, right? I mean, ideally, you work on your relationship with food, when and why and how you're eating, help control the blood sugar, and the end result should impact the rest of the body systems, the trickle-down effect.
Yeah, exactly. And, a piece of advice that someone gave recently, they said, if you're treating a patient and they come in with a long list of complaints, the first thing you do is get their glucose under control. And once that's under control, then you look at all the other complaints, because most of them will have gone by then. And I think that's the evidence that it's the carbohydrates and the other bad things in our diet and the other way we live that is the cause of the problem.
Yeah, for sure. That's what I liked when I'm coaching clients, is just first work on nutrition. That's the main thing to work on, and then work on the lifestyle habits and relationships, stress and all that. But what about intermittent fasting for you? Do you find that, that's beneficial in nutritional ketosis, or what's
that's really interesting, because I do intermittent fast, but I'm not often in serious ketosis. I have to, for me personally, my metabolism, I have to do a lot of running to get ketotic. So I am marginally, but I'm not seriously ketotic. But intermittent fasting is the way I eat, and I just eat so much less than I used to. I mean, food used to be a driving force in my life because of all these addictions, but now it's, I don't concern myself when I'm going to eat and what I'm going to eat next. It's what comes, and that's interesting. It's such a different attitude and different approach. And I think the more, as you will from your own experience will know, the more you do it, the more the need to worry about food sort of it disappears. It becomes, it's no longer an issue. It's not something that you worry about.
Well, I didn't know I was intermittent fasting until it became a thing, last few years, and then time restricted eating and having, cyclical keto is the other thing. It's like, should we be in nutritional ketosis all the time? There's a lot of people like Dr. Walls. I just talked to her and listened to her at conferences, but is one of the few people that do say you should not be in nutritional ketosis all the time, because our ancestors were not, it was on and off. So doing like a 5-2 plan might be more beneficial than trying to be in nutritional ketosis nonstop. So that's always an area of research that's like, it depends, or I guess.
Yeah, I think the one of the problems for some of us like myself is getting into ketosis is very difficult. It's a much more protein that we would normally eat. Sorry, it's much more fat than we might always eat, and that's difficult to stay in it. So I've never been able to achieve severe ketosis and stay in it. So,
but you're still burning fat.
Even though I'm only eating 25 grams or less, some days my carbohydrate intake is probably close to zero. But so just cutting carbs isn't going to produce ketosis in everyone. And I agree. I think that you must eat reasonable foods, and the result is whatever happens, happens.
Yeah,
if you ketotic, that's what happens.
Yeah, that's how I always think too. It's like, it just is naturally what my body's asking for, and listen to your body, what it needs. And it's interesting with, endurance athletes too, that you can't compare yourself to someone that's has health issues and they're eating 20 grams of carbs that, have type 2 diabetes, metabolically more damage than others. And they're trying to do, 20 grams, but I'm going to still train 15, 20 hours a week of endurance exercise and put more stress on your body.
Exactly. I can't agree with you more, that each of us is an experiment of one. That's the word.
Yes.
My great friend George Sheehan used to say, we're each an experiment of one. And you've got to get out there and find out what works for you.
Yeah.
And not be scared, because my great friend Bruce Fordyce, who won our Great Comrades Marathon 9 times, it's a 90-kilometer race, 56-mile race. And he said, a lot of people say they've run the Comrades 10 times. He said, no, they run it once, and they just repeat it 10 times. That's not the way to do it. You must find what works and then stick with it. But first, you've got to find what works. Yeah. And if you just repeat doing the same thing all the time, you're not going to know whether what was correct for you.
Exactly. So true. So I know my friend Kirsten Flanagan, that was one of her students, asked me some questions. I asked her what she would want to ask you. So we were talking a podcast we did about females and keto and carnivores, because a lot of people are into just doing the, nose to tail meat diet and not having any vegetables. But then I talked to other people that are, about the alkalinity balance of our pH and too acidic. And then there's females and there's female athletes. So it's like, again, there's not one size fits all approach. N equals 1, but what are your thoughts on carnivore to start?
Yeah, so I'm much more carnivore than I was, and I eat relatively little vegetables now. And I haven't noticed any issues for me, which, that's interesting. I like to, sorry, I also receive regular letters, emails and tweets and so on. People saying that they've reversed chronic diseases with going carnivorous. And I do think that there is something about the gut of some people that are very sensitive to certain chemicals in certain plants. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to say all plants and all vegetarian diets, not at all. I just think that there are some people who are incredibly sensitive and their gut leaks. And once they get gut leakage, then you can their proteins can access your bloodstream. You develop an immune response, and that comes out as an autoimmune disease. That's still an hypothesis, but if I was in clinical medicine today, that's what I would study, because it's so simple to find if that's true, to get patients who have got chronic autoimmune diseases and put them on a carnivorous diet for a month or two. And the people who I speak to say, you know, if it's going to work in 2 months. And that's all you have to do. And that's not a difficult experiment. And I would just love to see those experiments done.
Mm-hmm. But do you feel like if you're doing more carnivore, you need to be eating the organ meats to get the full nutrient balance?
Yeah, well, you know, I think that nutrition is so complex. It's so complex that we really are scratching the surface. And I'll give you an example. In Africa, we have all these different mammals which eat different diets. And most of them eat profoundly restricted diets. And the one is the giraffe. The giraffe eats one plant, essentially one plant, acacia leaves. Now, the acacia leaf, how can the acacia leaf possibly produce all the nutrients that it needs? It doesn't make sense. So this animal must have, over millions of years, produced the bacteria in its gut that when they fed acacia plants, they produce all the nutrients that this animal requires. One of my colleagues, this is a lovely story, one of my colleagues was called to North America to look at the zoos because their rhinoceroses coming from Africa were all dying, and they were dying of iron overload. And the zookeepers in New York couldn't understand why these rhinoceroses, which are very healthy in the wild, were suddenly developing this problem in the zoo. And he took one look and he said, hold it, what are you feeding them? I said, no, we're feeding them grass. I said, hold on. Right, there are two types of rhinoceroses in Africa. One eats grass and the other eats bushes. And the one you got here eats bushes. And you're feeding it grass. And then they worked out that there's more iron in grass than there is in bushes. And these rhinoceroses, over tens of millions of years, have developed a gut that can absorb iron from nothing. It can hyper-absorb iron. So if you give it just a touch more iron present in grass, that's it. The animal will develop iron overload and die as a result.
Wow.
So that's just an indication that there may well be some people who can live on a carnivorous diet without needing supplements or without eating other organ meats. But I would suspect you're probably better off eating everything, because if you look at the First Nations in North America, they ate the whole animals, and they knew that there were certain parts of the animal that were especially essential for older people or women who wanted to be pregnant or for babies and so on. So that was knowledge they would have collected over thousands of years, and you can't discount that evidence.
Yeah, it just is gross. It just is not tasty sounding to me, but I understand it. I just can't do it. So another question is about women. Have you gone into more specific on the females' need for a little more carbohydrates? We've talked to, about Dr. Stacy Sims had research over the years about women and keto, low carb, that they might need to add a little more carbs than a man does times of the month. It's a whole nother research study.
That's an area I'm not aware of. So I'm behind on that one.
Okay.
So it'll be very interesting to see if that's the case. But again, it comes down to the same old story.
N equals 1.
N equals 1, and we're all a little bit different, and we all have a different gut flora. We have a different grandmother. We have different mothers. We had a different experience there, what they ate in their pregnancies, what they were fed when they were weaned, and so on. And all those factors come into what will make you healthier with the foods that you're eating.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I've done the DNA Fit. I know they have people in Africa, South Africa, that they have an office down there, but DNA Fit, and there's other genetic programs that are interesting to look at what your body does best with based on your genetics and with nutrition and exercise recommendations. But I've had mine done. I've done it a couple other programs, and it's, I do better with low carb, but it's funny. I was thinking, well, who does better with high carb? But I think it's looking at metabolic type, because another way we look at nutrition is, based on your cellular level, do you need more of a mixed ratio, or are you a slower fast oxidizer, and figure out that. I don't know if you've ever looked into that.
Well, what I can tell you is that I know one of our students did her PhD in this area. And the problem is with a lot of dietitians and their training is they're so biased to the low fat story and away from the low carbohydrate story that they tend to interpret everything according to that rule. And so when the results come back, they're still biased to give you a low fat diet, even independent of what the results say. And I would question the original research. What was the basic beliefs of the people who did the original research? And were they looking for the genes that would say a low fat diet is better? Because bias goes back all the way, and we're all biased. And it's very difficult if you have been promoting a particular diet for a long time, not to see that all the evidence points towards that diet being better. And so that's what worries me. I never saw on that testing a person told to eat a low carbohydrate diet on the basis of that testing. That's in Cape Town. I'm not talking about the rest of the world. But the bias in Cape Town is so much that you would literally get thrown out of the profession if you told someone to eat a low carbohydrate diet. So then they use the testing, and the testing always confirms that you must eat a low fat diet. So then the question is, well, how specific, how accurate is this testing?
Yeah. Wow. So again, N=1. And I always tell people test and not guess. I mean, test your blood sugar. Isn't that just the best way to know if you're eating right for your metabolic type or for your body?
I must tell you a lovely story on that one, because so a colleague who works for a big insurance company, and they extended into other countries all over the world. And now they wanted to introduce a new program. And they'd read the research from Israel, which shows that if you are, that the ability to cope with carbohydrates differs in different people, and that some cope slightly better with others. So that just saying this is carbohydrate, you must need carbohydrate, some people could eat a little bit more carbohydrate. So then they wanted to set up a testing. So then they started looking with continuous glucose monitoring. And so he said, Tim, I'd like you to use your continuous glucose monitoring, and you just eat your diet and I'll eat my diet, you see. So this is this doctor. And so when it came back, I'd done my diet. My glucose was flat, just all day, every day, just flat. And the results were amazing. I mean, he'd never seen results like that in someone my age. And then his results were all over the place. And he asked me, so how would you analyze the data? I said, well, I think the time that your glucose is above 6.5, I'd quantify that as a percentage of the time and say, and it turned out in his case, I think it was 30% of the time his glucose was above 6.5. And so I said, if you're going to eat carbohydrates, that's the result you're going to get. Maybe if you're slightly different, it's going to be 25% of the time, or it's going to be 40% of the time, but it's going to be high. And the only way you can get the glucose down is don't eat carbohydrates. And that's the message that you have to give. You can't take everyone and say, okay, now we're going to titrate the amount of carbohydrate you're allowed to eat. It's still going to be 50 or 100 grams. It's never going to be the 300 grams that people want to eat. So as soon as you say we're going to measure your glucose, well, you might as well just say, well, okay, well, let's keep the carbohydrate intake down at below 50 grams per day.
You think, you know, people probably staying at home right now are having more blood sugar issues because what got bought off all the grocery store shops when people said they were going to be stuck at home for a month, they bought a bunch of processed foods that were probably all carbohydrate based and lots of garbage,
Yeah.
and not eating. Like we ordered three shipments of Butcher Box, which is grass-fed meat. We ordered that 3 times this month instead of, you know, the normal people go buy the cereals and the breads and the crackers and chips and all that.
And the vegan fake meat.
Yeah, that too, another topic. So I know we're running out of time, but last question, or there's 2, Kristen, as who have the people been supporting you the most through your journey, changing your mindset publicly and going on trial for it in South Africa and around the world?
Well, unquestionably, it was Eric Westman and Volek and Finney who inspired me with their book. And that, when I read that book, it took me 2 hours to realize I'd got it all wrong for 33 years. So that's quite powerful if you think.
Yes.
That one book in 2 hours managed to change my mind completely. And the reason was because I knew that they were good scientists and I trusted them. And they had one statement. It said there are 150 clinical trials of this diet. And Eric and Jeff and Steve are the ones who've done most of those studies early on. So they're hugely, hugely influential. And I think the next one was Gary Taubes, because then I read his book and that was just amazing. I thought, no, that is astonishing book. And, you know, a lot of people will find it too long and too detailed, but his knowledge is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I think it must be very frustrating because people, even myself, I'm only now catching up a little bit on his knowledge, which he'd written this 15 years ago or something.
Yeah, long time.
And so that he was so far ahead of the field that it's astonishing. I mean, I read that book and it's as up to date as the stuff he's got there is as up to date as anything. In other words, the problems or the concepts that he produced, they are still absolutely current today. So that was critical. Then reading Nina's book, and that came out 2014. And I was just being targeted by my profession, absolutely targeted. And one of the great moments for me was this. What really upset me the most was 4 senior professors at the university, including the dean of my faculty, wrote this atrocious letter to the newspaper, defaming me and saying all sorts of things about me being a bad scientist, which is unbelievable. I mean, the university kicked me out essentially with this letter. So of course I complained to the university, and eventually I got to speak to the 2 of the professors in open debate. And I took Nina's book, and it was just before Christmas. And I gave each of them a copy, and I said, "Now just read that book." Perfect. And see what you think. And it was 1 week after there had been an editorial on the book in the British Medical Journal. So here was this editorial written by Dr. Smith saying, "You've got to read this book because it is revolutionary." And I handed it to them, and I can guarantee you they never read the book. They wouldn't have read it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. That book is one I suggest everyone getting for sure if they just want to, if they don't believe what you're saying, you know, just because she has all the 10 years of her research in there. It's amazing.
And going through the book again, she's the first person, I think, who really focused on the vegetable oils and how bad they are. And I learned, even today, rereading the book, I learned a huge amount. But the other thing was she dissected out the origins of the Mediterranean diet. And that's it's a magnificent chapter.
A lot of vacation trips for people in the industry. That's what it was. Trips to Europe and Italy. He's like, who doesn't want to go to Italy? I'll do whatever you say. I'll go so I can go on vacation.
That's exactly right. And that's how the industry works. So those were the books. And then when it came to my trial, there was, of course, my wife who stuck it out with me, and was just amazing. Without her support, I wouldn't have got through it. But what I learned in the trial was that when there are a lot of people, they disperse. They don't want to know you. And that was many people. And literally it was myself and my wife were left
Wow.
And then I had my lawyers, and there were two guys who were just absolutely astonishing. And just to, just to pay tribute to them. One of them is Dr. Rocky Ramdas, who's a medical doctor who's so clever that eventually he decided he wanted to do law as well. And so in his spare time, as a busy general practitioner, he studied law, and then he qualified as a lawyer. And I was his principal expert witness at one stage in one trial, and that's where we bonded, just like this. And when I realized I was in trouble, I said, Rocky, I need your help. He said, brother, I'm with you, and I'm not going to charge you 1 cent. And he gave me millions of rands worth of support.
Oh my gosh.
And we bonded like this, and we are brothers. We call each other brother. And it's so funny because now he's doing something else, and he asked me to help him. He's writing a book, and he wants me to edit it. And geez, that's the least I can do for him.
Yeah.
But I can just tell you that the joy of the trial was working with him. We had such a good time. And the funniest things where he said, now, Prof, you're going to be cross-examined, and I want to show you what a cross-examination is all about. And if you read our book, The Real Food on Trial, he cross-examined all the prosecution's witnesses, and he destroyed them one after the other. They just went down like a sack of potatoes. He was just like them. The funniest thing was he would lead them down a route. He'd be questioning them, and he'd suddenly stop and he'd change to something else. And then you said, oh my gosh, he's got something. And you could see his eyes would just go like this. You see the whites of his eyes. And you knew the person was about to be dropped. And he would leave them. And then an hour later, he'd come back to that. And he would take them further. And then, poof, they were gone. He dropped them. So he was, law is an amazing profession. And I asked Rocky, I said, Rocky, what's the difference between medicine and law? He said, it's simple. Medicine is what might be, but law is what is. And that's the difference. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. And I realized that's the problem with medicine, is it's always, oh, this could be, that could be, this could be the other thing. And that covers up so much that we don't know. And we pretend we know it by saying, well, it could be this, it could be that. And I think that's part of the frustration with medicine. Medicine is also not like engineering. No, engineering, the outcome is important.
Yes.
If the bridge collapses, that's a bit of a problem. But in medicine, if we give you a statin drug and it helps 1 in 1,000 people, we say, well, that's great, you must take it. I mean, it's unbelievable.
I know, we won't go down that road, but yeah, it's so true. But I know I want to mention too that, you have influenced a ton of people. As, one of your students, Kirsten Flanagan, said that you helped her decide to shift her career into helping with low carb. And so she's in actually Cape Town now, but she's working in the US helping Sean Wells do some research and articles on fasting and low carb. And so we were connecting, but she mentioned you played a pivotal role in shifting her career focus towards low carb, higher fat approach. And she has been researching and implementing into her own life for 6 years. And ever since she went to one of your talks, she changed everything. And that was, you were lecturing at UCT, and she said you've been instrumental for the keto movement in South Africa. So you've made a difference, and that's just one person, but I'm sure there's millions of others. But last question to finish up with, banting. The real meal revolution, let's wrap up. And I know you've got to have your evening ahead with your wife, but the banting and keto going in South Africa, and what's the progression in the rest of the world? I was just looking around to see if I had the book. I don't, unfortunately, have it here. But anyway, so banting, we wrote that book in 2014, I think, or 2013. And before that, the name banting was not known in South Africa. No one knew what the term banting meant. And by the way, I must say that the great-great-great-grandson of banting wrote to me, and he's very angry that we stole his great-great-great-grandfather's name, because he says, but the diet you propose is not banting. It's not what my great-great-great-grandfather said it was. And I think he wants to get the name back so he can promote what he thinks banting said.
because Banting actually ate more carbohydrates than we prescribed. But anyway, that's just another issue. So anyway, Banting, the name comes to Cape Town in South Africa in 2013. One of the first people we influenced in Cape Town was a lady called Rita Fento, who's just an amazing woman. And she converted to the diet, and her husband converted, and he had some medical issues, and he got much better. And then she said, you know, Tim, the problem with your book, The Real Meal Revolution, is it just tells you how to prepare a meal. It doesn't help you to work out what you should be eating on a 7-day plan. So she set up a website and a Facebook page, I should say, called the Banting 7-Day Meal Plan Facebook page. And she helped people draw up meal plans because she said that's what's missing. Today, that Facebook page has 2 million followers.
Oh, look
2 million followers. And people come to her from the US and say, but how did you do it? And she said, it's quite simple. We took everyone seriously and we did not embarrass anyone. We supported everyone. And it was this caring attitude, because that's what she's like. And that could help people lose 100 pounds and be very proud of it. Anyway, the point is that last year they produced a cookbook called the Banting 7-Day Meal Plan recipes. And it's just gone like hotcakes.
Wow. And
it's a brilliant, brilliant book. But these are the people who converted to the diet, and it's their recipes.
Oh, that's a great idea.
So I know that I've helped maybe 2 million people in South Africa alone. Wow. And there's not too many doctors in the world who can say they've had that influence. So
true.
I'm very proud of that.
And then, so what is your plan? What's coming up next in the next year or two? Your new book on insulin resistance and diabetes?
That's right. So that's the one book. And then I didn't mention our nutrition network from the Noakes Foundation. Mm-hmm. And that's something we hit on about a year ago or 2 years ago. We decided we must convert the doctors, but you can only convert the doctors if you give them the information. And so this is an online training program, which is CME accredited. And the doctors have been amazing. They've really bought in. And we've been very, very successful in educating many people around the world on the low-carb diet. And the money that we use, that we earn from that, we put into our Eat Better South Africa campaign. So that funds what we're doing for the poorer communities in South Africa. So before lockdown, we just got quite a nice amount of money to move forward on that.
Oh, great.
And that's what we're going to be focusing on. As soon as the lockdown ends, introducing a wide scale, much larger number of programs in the poorest communities. And finally getting some credit from local government and working with them as well to extend it beyond our limited resources.
Wow, that's amazing. It just gives you chills, right? Just what you can do in your own city, country.
Yeah.
And so I know we can put the links in the show notes for how to support the Noakes Foundation. The research studies I saw were listed on there, and future books, and then the Banting information is on there. But also there's a certification process I saw. Is it through the Low Carb Tip for Nutrition, Low Carb Coaches to be everyone be unified?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we have that certification program. Correct.
Yeah. So you got lots going on. You're supposed to be slowly retiring, but you seem like you're just doing more.
Yeah, there's still, I think you have to keep your brain going. And I mean, I think one of the great benefits of the low carb diet is that I hope we can put off dementia for another 10 years or so. Yeah. And physically to get strong and keep strong. And I watch, because being 70 is fantastic, because now you can see the other people who've been eating the high carb diets, they start to slow down a bit after 70.
Yeah, it's a new 60 or the 50.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, okay, well, thank you so much for sharing your evening with us, and we will look forward to following you and keeping up to date with your research. Do you post more on Twitter, or what's your social media outlet?
Yeah, it's at Prof Tim Noakes. So I'm very active on Twitter, so gets me into a lot of trouble, but it's astonishing where you can share information
Yeah.
and pick up the latest information. It's absolutely, I thank goodness it didn't come along when I was a medical student, because I think it would have been swamped with information and you wouldn't have known what to do with it all.
Oh yeah,
So,
I need to get on there.
Yeah,
That's
no,
good.
please, at Prof Tim Noakes.
Okay, well, we'll follow you and put everything, the links below the podcast. And we look forward to just all the stuff you're doing, keep contributing to the low carb world. So we appreciate everything you do. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Debbie. Lovely to chat to you. Thank you so much for a lovely afternoon's discussion.